Welcome, everyone, to the panel. We're kicking off the IPP forum, and so we're really glad that you're here, Rethinking the State, and we have a wonderful lineup. We will be hearing from a great panel, and we're going to be talking about rethinking public value in the age of DOGE. What does this mean? What are we thinking about? And how can we rethink certain things along the way? And so right beside me is Mariana Mazzucato, founding director and professor of economics at UCL at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And next to Mariana, we have Rohit Chopra. And so Rohit is the former director of the U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and former commissioner for the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. Rohit is a visionary regulator who has served as the U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's third director, appointed by the Biden administration and confirmed by the Senate in 2021. During his tenure, the agency obtained $10 billion in victim refunds and penalties from firms that violated the law. He previously served as commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission from 2018 to 2021, where he played a major role in reviving the agency's lax approach to antitrust and privacy law enforcement. Next to Rohit, we also have Damon. So Damon is a visiting professor of practice in labor markets and innovation at UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and also served as the director of policy and special counsel for the AFL-CIO. So please join me in welcoming our illustrious panel. So to get us started, why are we gathered? A central question driving the discussion is whether DOGE is truly enhancing or disrupting public trust, accountability, and more broadly, public value. Additionally, how can public institutions effectively mediate and balance the political economic dynamics between state and the private sector to ensure that public value is both achieved and enhanced, and for present and future generations? In 2014, the United States Digital Service, USDS, was established as a technology unit within the Executive Office of the President of the United States. In 2025, it was subsequently reorganized as the US DOGE Service, so Department of Government Efficiency, according to Executive Order 14158 by the Trump administration. At the heart of public value lies a vision of the state and local government that extends far beyond mere efficiency. It also centers on the capacity of public organizations to foster democratic accountability, political legitimacy and public participation, institutional trust, and public sector dynamic capabilities, with public institutions and civil servants acting as the stewards of those shared values. And so, the question that we will explore together is that they will talk is today we'll explore these ideas through three interwoven stories. A story of a public organization story, examining how institutions are built, challenged, and maintained. A public values story, tracing the principles that guide how governments define and pursue public value through structural transformation processes. And a political economic story, uncovering the forces that shape how public institutions and values rise and fall, and where they get contested. And so together, each speaker will guide our reflection on what it means to rethink public value, looking back at the creation of the CFPB, our Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, reckoning with the aftermath of DOGE, the DOGE initiative, and thinking and asking what's needed for the future as governments grapple with what their digital transformations, such as AI and platform governance, means for the future of democratic accountability and public value across the state and globe. So please join us in hearing from our panel. Yeah. To begin...
And can we thank Nye for organizing this? It was her idea.
Thank you, Mariana. So first, we're going to hear from Rohit, our guest speaker. Please take it away.
Well, thank you, Nye, and thanks all of you for being here in this unusually very warm day here in London. So I know that we're really talking about some institutional issues and developments in the U.S., but I think there are just some gigantic lessons for all of us if you want to see the state, business, and community build better societies. This really is an important flashpoint for all of us, but I think we should remember different flashpoints and really what did some of our democracies and societies do. So I'll start with just very, very briefly after the mortgage crisis, there really was there's a story that this is created by greedy bankers, people who are out of control. That's true, but another part of the story is that it was also caused by a set of government agencies and regulators who made a choice to allow themselves to put blindfolds over their eyes and allow unbelievable fraud and abuse to infect the entire marketplace and ultimately crash the global economy. And the human effects of that, it was not simply we paid a little bit of extra. We saw more people across the globe lose their homes, lose really a sense of dignity and, a little louder, a bit of dignity and well-being. And frankly, the result of it was that the largest banks in the United States actually got bigger in the process. They got bailed out, and the people who were those who actually suffered lost big. In the US, we actually measure a statistic, the racial wealth gap, because of the history that we have. The US financial crisis destroyed decades of progress in narrowing the racial wealth gap. A society that has a history of something called redlining that excluded people altogether from accessing the housing and mortgage market. So these were really big effects. So out of those ashes, obviously they create some new agencies, some new rules, some new laws, but less discussed is the fact that there was also a less talked about operation to shut down broken and corrupt agencies that were not serving the public. They were actually serving the entities they were supposed to look after. And I think that is what this Department of Government Efficiency, what many people, journalists and senators in the US refer to as DOGE, it is now leading not really to material savings. The estimates have gone from $2 trillion US dollars and I think is now down to 150 billion US, and it keeps going down. Not really material savings, but actually shutting down the watchdogs and turning them into lapdogs. We are seeing the process of enforcement agencies pardoning companies, literally pulling out lawsuits out of courts, giving green lights. One of the largest banks in the United States is called Wells Fargo. It was involved in a massive scandal that fabricated fake bank accounts all over the country. And just recently, the independent, quote unquote, Federal Reserve Board completely lifted all those sanctions. So we're starting to see things come apart. And I think we'll go into more detail into the discussion, but one of the things that I want to make sure we are all laser focused on is that it cannot be about reverting to what we had. It is not reboot, it is reimagine and reconstruct. And this conference that you will have over these next several days, I think will help us really put into clearer picture the things we need to do about that. Another thing I want to leave with you in this discussion is that let's put the U.S. aside for a second. We cannot deny the fact that some of those same trends that we're seeing in the U.S. are all over the world. Huge distrust in government, an information ecosystem that is increasingly controlled by a handful of massive technology conglomerates, the rise of new ways to organize and communicate that actually are not really working. And I think we have other trends that suggest that this is not an isolated issue and that the effects of the financial crisis and COVID are challenging us to fundamentally rethink how we want our governments and our state to work. So I think we'll get into that into the discussion, but I think we have a big task ahead of us in not just copying and pasting what we had before, but really to look at something very, very different.
Thank you. Next, we will be hearing from Mariana Mazzucato.
You said it perfectly. And just again, there's actually 5 seats still here in case anyone in the back cannot hear or see. So thank you so much, Rohit. You really set the scene. And I think where we can be helpful in terms of, well, definitely my role in terms on this panel as the founder of this institute is not just to talk about the US, but also look at what's actually happening around the world. Because I actually think that DOGE or DOGE is actually really just icing on the cake. It's the last chapter of 50 years of decimation, attempt at decimation of government capacity. And the people who benefit from it the most are those actually, ironically, who still rely on government money, not capacity, money, probably weak capacity, because when you don't have strong capacity, you just give out money without knowing what you're doing. And Elon Musk, as we all know, and I've been writing about this now for a very long time, before it became fashionable, has benefited massively from Uncle Sam's dollars and never said thank you. I actually once tweeted, at least say thank you. And then he did. So you can tell I'm an Italian mother with 4 kids. Say thank you, go make your bed. And I was like, okay, at least he did that. But he didn't actually say completely thank you. In fact, even, it was interesting. I don't know why I'm going off on tangents. I tend to do that. But even Bill Gates, he's really interesting because I think Bill Gates, unlike Peter Thiel, 2 people who are seen as, billionaires in the tech space, Bill Gates has always actually thanked government in many ways. He admits that government has been important to his own success. He once invited me out to, I was going to say Silicon Valley, no, Seattle. Flew me out there and said, read your book, The Entrepreneurial State. You're absolutely right. We just don't have that right now for the green economy. And he said, but Steve and I was like, Steve who? Steve Jobs and I benefited, he said, massively. And then he only focused, though, on the more kind of obvious bit that they benefited from, and he was absolutely right, which was the basic research and development spending. And I was like, and? What else did you benefit from? So if you actually look at what happened in Silicon Valley, and this is why I wrote the book, The Entrepreneurial State, was that there was actually a decentralized network of public agencies. I want to come back to the concept of agencies and organizations, not just public money, that basically co-created, it wasn't just government, but very much leading with government money, what later basically is known as Silicon Valley. So all the technologies that make your iPhone smart and not stupid phones were not only government financed, yes, we know that, or we should know that, but from agencies that were problem oriented, right? So what is the role of government? Is it just to de-risk, facilitate, enable, all these really boring words that makes you want to fall asleep? No, they had problems to solve. So the military is good at doing this because the military has a huge problem to solve: win the war. So it's not naive. It doesn't just throw out money, right? So military industrial complex agencies, whether it was DARPA and NASA, by the way, both set up in a time in the US where the Republican military general, President Eisenhower, had a marginal top taxation rate of over 90%. We can come back to that later because we should definitely talk about tax. But these were, again, agencies that had problems to solve, so the internet came about, not like today where people say AI, quantum computing. No, they had a problem to solve. The satellites needed to communicate. The internet was a solution. And along the way, there's also failures, right? So there's a portfolio approach, win some, lose some. But we know that in order for government to solve problems, and again, they know how to do it with war, less good at doing it with our social problems, you need problem orientation and partnerships. So again, why I set up this whole institute was to say, what would it look like to normalize that ambition, where you have problem orientation in government that works with the private sector in a way that has capacity to govern those relationships, but also that knows what is this for, not just with war, but do we want to actually, produce vaccines that are available to the whole world instead of just outputs, right? Outcomes. Do we want net zero cities? Do we want to reduce the digital divide so that in the next pandemic, if there is one, hopefully not, but the science says that as the permafrost melts, viruses will come our way, that we have all kids continuing to access their public education, with digital technology. So if government's supposed to be outcomes and problem-oriented, the big question is, does it have the capacity to do that? Does it even see itself as being problem-oriented, or is it just fixing market failures, right? And how does it work with others? Because it's never just about government. Of course you need to work with others, but not just giving out subsidies, loan guarantees, tax incentives, so on and so forth. So the whole point of the Institute and of this wonderful festival, and I think Carolina Alves is here and she helped us, but she really led it on with Angela, our comms team, and putting this together, is to rethink the state. Not because the state is better than any other organization, but it's become weaker. Even big states can be weak. Forget big and small. A strategic, outcomes-oriented, mission-oriented state, what does that look like? And learning from it, not by saying, is it China or is it the US? It's like, where did we witness that organizational capacity? Where did we witness good partnerships, what I often call symbiotic partnerships, not parasitic partnerships, to solve those problems? And what kind of education, then, is required for that, right? Because people get educated to do stuff. There is a curriculum for the civil service, and one of the things we pride ourselves here, because we're an academic institute, we're not a think tank. We do a lot of thinking and a lot of tanking, but we are in academia. We're trying to rewrite the curriculum for the civil service globally, which is around kind of more, much more ambitious pillars of value, of purpose, creative bureaucracies, design thinking, digital governance. For what? For shaping our society and economy to deliver for people and planet. And so it's really interesting, big intro, but it's not really an intro, it's what I'm going to say, is that Trump actually, this whole doggy Doge thing, not only is it kind of one of the last chapters of a 50-year battle, I would argue, against the state, but he actually began with this and Trump won. He just didn't call it Doge, right? The first thing, I don't know if you remember, that Trump did in Trump won, and it was almost funny, because people then did funny cartoons about this, he went after Big Bird. He went after public broadcasting service in the US in Trump won. He went after ARPA-E. It was actually Rumsfeld that for some reason, I think, was it, no, who was Trump's first vice president, sorry? Yeah, what's his name?
Pence?
No, oh God, no, sorry, there was another guy who went after ARPA-E. I'm trying to remember.
The defense secretary?
No, okay, it'll come back, sorry, let's just blame age. Anyway, the point is Trump was president and they went after organizations. Why? Because they're smart. If you want to decimate state capacity, you don't go after the money. Money comes and goes. Conservative governments here have done austerity, and then next thing we know, money's back. So money can easily come and go. What doesn't come back, if you kind of, weaken state capacity in organizations like the BBC, witness what's happening here, for all of those who are from the UK. If you weaken the ability of government, not just in the military, because no one really ever wants to weaken the military. Money comes out of thin air for the military, as we've seen recently, right? No money for climate. Oh, for military, lots of money in Germany. You go after organizational capacity, right? Because it can take, I don't want to say centuries, but decades for that to come back. Money comes back in overnight. Organizational, even inspiration, right? Like the BBC is noteworthy actually for attracting top talent into it because it never saw its role as just fixing a market. It actually shaped the broadcasting landscape. It didn't just say, oh, we're going to do documentaries and high quality news and let business do the fun stuff, right? Soap operas and talk shows. Now we're doing everything, but with public value metrics. And they actually have a metric of public value, and we have recently worked with them on that. And one of my PhD students, Najma, here is actually doing a PhD on this. So the real question, I don't know why I have all these papers. The real question is, what for an academic institution is, what is the new research we also need? Around, what is market shaping? What do we mean by public value? How can we push it further? And what is the kind of capacity we need within in order to govern these really complex problems? And if you look again at the curriculum in MBA programs, it's kind of really cool. It's like organizational science, this organizational behavior, decision sciences, strategic management. And if you compare it to the standard MPA, public administration, it's much more exciting. And that's not because there's more exciting people teaching it, it's because we know we value the private sector. So of course the private sector needs capacity, and there's MBA programs, and they study how to rejuvenate the mature corporation when a company gets big. It's got to resist the bureaucracy. Whereas because we don't value the public sector, we don't have those interesting questions. We just roll our eyes and say, oh, bureaucracy, right? As opposed to what? Creative, agile, flexible bureaucracy in order to work well. So I could say more, but just to say, first of all, you know, what Rosie Collington and I, she's one of my PhD students, we wrote this book called The Big Con. When we talked about the outsourcing, the privatization, the consultification of so many different government departments, that wasn't by coincidence, right? If you just go back to what I said, if you're not there to create value, if you're just there to fix a market, if in the process you're made to feel fear of doing anything more than that, I'll stop right now, no wonder you become so risk averse, even if you actually know what you're doing, and sometimes you don't know what you're doing because you haven't invested in that capacity, that you become fearful of doing anything more than just fixing markets, and it's better just to rubber stamp stuff with Deloitte, KPMG, or McKinsey. Could say much more about that, but if you get me on consulting, I'll never shut up. So happy to move on to Damon, but just to say all these things are connected. The education, the capacity, what is government for, organizational design. And if you look at the whole Rethinking the State festival, we're kind of trying to tackle each one by one, but they're all connected.
I think this might work. Wow. Good afternoon. I'm Damon Silvers. First, I want to say what a thrill it is to be on this panel with these two astounding people, and actually three astounding people, because Nye represents the astoundingness that will replace us all, essentially. The reason I'm on this panel, I think, in addition to being friends with everybody, is that I was the deputy chair of the U.S. Congressional Oversight Panel for TARP, which was the bank bailout. And that body also formulated what the financial regulatory reform agenda ought to be, had a mandate from the U.S. Congress following the bank crisis. And Elizabeth Warren was the chair of that body. I was the deputy chair. And we wrote the recommendation that there should be a CFPB. And I think and I had something else. I was involved in some other things, and I want to talk about that right now. Because I think where we want to sort of go from here, from this framing, is to get into a little detail about what makes for successful state market shaping. And I would sort of state that the CFPB has been an example of that, despite the fundamental ambiguity or uncertainty about policy of the larger policymaking environment after the 2008 crisis as to whether we should engage in market shaping at all. All right. That the CFPB has managed through its institutional evolution to actually engage in that. And that's why it was a target of DOGE. Now, what are the things that, the key thing, and Rohit talked about it, by the way, you cannot overestimate the impact of the 2008 crisis on the world we live in. I have a couple of lectures you can watch in great detail about this here at IIPP on YouTube. But if you want to ask, where did resurgent authoritarianism come from? Right? Where did the deep distrust in the possibility that government could act in the public interest come from? It came from the fact that the crisis occurred when all the smartest people in government around the world were saying it was impossible, and that then the solution to the crisis was to reward the people that caused it. Despite the fact that there was a known playbook that dated back to the Depression for how to deal with the crisis in a very different way that would have been in the public interest. That's my 30-second summary of the financial crisis. Now, one of the key causes of the crisis was the realization that although the United States had a ton of financial regulatory agencies, like 8, none of them was focused specifically on protecting the public. They all, to one degree or another, had what was called a safety and soundness mandate, meaning to keep the banks or the other financial institutions they regulated, whatever they were, to keep them afloat. And keeping the financial institution that they regulated afloat always trumped the public interest in relation to the consumer. FDIC, Federal Reserve, Office of the Control of the Currency, the Thrifts, OTS, which was the corrupt agency that Rohit was talking about. I can say it was corrupt agency. It's what led to AIG's collapse. They all had this mandate. They all had these double mandates. Right? And so the first thing was that if you wanted to protect the public, that had to be the mission. The mission had to be protecting the public. Secondly, you had to have expertise, deep expertise. You had to have proper staffing, highly motivated people, esprit de corps, and deep expertise. Why? Because of the enormous information advantages that the banks had. Right? So the only way to effectively regulate them was to have this focused, expert institution. Now, what does this sound like? This should ring a bell with you. This sounds like platform companies, right? This sounds like AI, right? Huge institutions with huge information advantages over not just the public, but the state, right? So keep this in mind as we talk about the CFPB. So but what was the third thing? The third thing you needed to have an effective state intervention in market shaping. So just repeat this again, right? One is a clear mission, right? Protect the public in the financial markets. Two is expertise and esprit de corps, right? And resources. Three is political backing. Three is constituencies prepared to fight for it, who understand what's at stake. In the case of the CFPB, as soon as the financial crisis hit, the labor movement convened a wide range of U.S. civil society and a bunch of old experts, people like Paul Volcker, and Paul Volcker was very old and very expert. Lovely man, even though he helped destroy the labor movement in the 70s. Paul Volcker, some other people who validated it, but importantly, this wide range of advocates, housing, civil rights. Remember the racial wealth gap? That number might sound kind of abstract. What the racial wealth gap was at the depth of the crisis. The median household net worth of an African American family was $7,000. $7,000. So less, as the president of the AFL-CIO said, less than the value of a used car. Median household net worth of white families, $120,000 in the United States at the depth of the crisis. Those numbers, by the way, are not that different today. They've improved a little bit. That coalition meant that it was very difficult for politicians in both parties, but particularly in the Democratic Party, who'd taken a lot of money from Wall Street to double deal on us. Right? It meant that there was huge pressure on people who would never have done it 2 years earlier, right, to actually pass the Dodd-Frank Act with a real CFPB in it, to resource it and to defend it. This goes to this critical question that we try to ask here at IIPP at all times, which is, it is not enough to have a good idea. You have to have a political plan. You have to have a political strategy. It's not just a what, but a how and a who. Right? And in the CFPB, we were extraordinarily effective at executing that. Right? And it happened to be the idea, in truth, of an extraordinarily effective academic who decided to be a politician, our friend Elizabeth Warren. Now, it is not surprising in the context of this that Elon Musk and DOGE chose to attack the CFPB. Right? But this raises the question of why, and not why, but what are they? What are they when they attack the CFPB? Are they anything different than just another sort of right-wing defunding of an effective public agency? Oh, and just one more thing I meant to say before we got to that, which is this issue of market shaping versus market correction. Much of the sort of policy establishment around finance in 2008 had this view that, oh, we just made some mistakes, or we just sort of forgot to look at this particular institution. Tim Geithner, the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, used to talk about line of sight. I want to make sure I have line of sight everywhere. Now, line of sight's a good idea, but you had a financial system structurally designed to impoverish the public, enrich a handful of people, and crash all the time. Right? It needed to be reshaped, but it was very hard to get political agreement on whether or not to actually do that. All right? So the Dodd-Frank Act is a series of compromises around this question. and ball and can kicking and so forth. The CFPB turned out not to be. The CFPB turned out to be an effective institution of market shaping. Right? Now, when we look at DOGE, what is DOGE? Is DOGE anything different than the kind of attack on Big Bird that occurred like in 2017? I think DOGE purports to be something. It has a political. It purports to be something substantive, which it is not. All right. It has a political purpose, which is somewhat hidden, which, whether or not which has kind of passed its due date, so to speak. It's kind of failed at it, but it might have done the job while it needed to do it, right? And it has a deep underlying effect. What it is in terms of what it purports to be is the deployment of artificial intelligence in the management of government and the realization of gigantic savings as a result of that. That's why you have all these 18-year-olds sort of running around, because they're supposed to know about artificial intelligence. Now, I just came from a series of seminars on this subject at Harvard Business School, where there's a lot of money involved in trying to get it right. If you think about it for a second. The faculty there has done work on this and thinks there's huge potential gains in AI, but nobody knows how to get them yet. So the idea that sending a bunch of 18-year-olds into the U.S. government to rip everything apart, it's sort of the Sophia the robot of artificial intelligence. It's like you wave your hands and pretend that this is AI, but what you're really doing is just ripping out the pipes, right? The way that criminals go into houses, abandoned houses, and rip out the pipes. That's what these guys were doing, really. They couldn't know how to use artificial intelligence effectively in this setting because at the moment nobody does. We are just learning. Right? So it had this ideological justification that had no real basis, and the numbers show it, from $2 trillion in purported savings to $180 billion maybe heading down, right? And probably it'll turn out to be a net loss at the end. Now, what purpose did that serve? The Trump administration needed cover for its real agenda, which was to pass this gigantic unfunded tax bill, and to claim that there were trillions of dollars of savings in government available gave political momentum to a tax bill that is actually going to increase the U.S. national debt by somewhere around between $4 and $6 trillion. To pretend that you had $2 trillion in savings was very politically useful for a few months. It got you going. Now the fact that it doesn't actually exist, well, it's kind of too late. But what does it cover for? And Rohit was talking about the yanking of the cases. What it is cover for is the attempt to transform the neoliberal state into a predatory state. A predatory state. What is a predatory state? The great British historian Perry Anderson wrote about the court of Charlemagne. And he said, there are all these myths and stories and stuff, knights in shining armor. That's not what it was. It was a bunch of guys with clubs who would loot monasteries and steal chickens from farmers and retreat to their castle, and when they ate all the chickens, go out and do it again. Right? It was the protection racket elevated to this grand thing. What these people have in mind is a predatory state on a global scale. All right. Now, they're going to fail. They're going to fail. Predatory states in modern world, it's not going to work. When they fail, what is our ambition? What is our ambition? And Rohit, I think, has challenged us that our ambition needs to be not to try to go backwards, but to go forwards and to have really grand imagination, to deal with the real problems that we face, genuine market shaping. And we need to ask the question about the financial, we need to ask this question in the United States, we need to ask this question about healthcare in a huge way. And we need to ask this question about climate change and public investment, where we need to expand on the ambitions of the Biden administration. By the way, these things can have their analogs elsewhere. But to come back to the CFPB and the financial markets, we need to ask the question, really, not just have we tolerated the growth of the big banks beyond all reason, but have we tolerated the financialization of our society beyond all reason? Right? if you go back and look at the post-war world in much of the developed world, housing, education, and healthcare were largely not the subject of the financial markets. Are we better off now for having put them into the markets?
Student debt,
So, ask, I mean, where does housing stand in Britain today compared to where it stood in 1970? Right. The answer to that question is horrifying in relationship to the general wealth of the society. Right? And you could ask the same question about the financialization of all of these things. The market shaping question, and this is one of Mariana's many great contributions, I think, to public dialogue in our time. The market shaping question is not the question of should we tweak how we price housing, or it's what is the fundamental, how do we fundamentally finance and manage it?
Damon, we're going to have to
and
move
that's
on.
it.
Yeah,
And
but
that's it.
thank you. I think that our fantastic speakers have raised some interesting provocations for us to think about, and we're about to head into an audience Q&A. And so if you have a question, wait for the microphone to come to you. Tell us who you are and where you're from, and make sure your question ends in a question mark. And so please take it away.
Raise your voice.
Thank you for this. I'm Gina Neff. I run the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy at Cambridge. Great panel. My question, can the panelists please connect the DOGE project to the AI project more explicitly? If we think we're seeing the financialization of everyday life, what does that intersection of financialization meets an ideology of technology? How would you square those in terms of government value?
I'm going to try, because that's a big question. I think that Mariana really framed this well, which is, what are the problems we have to try and solve? And we have actually solved these very, very, very big problems that involve the state. I actually love hearing from people who say, it's so good to live in a really free market with no real government intervention. And I say to them, we have a government agency in almost every single country in the world that sets the price and supply of money every month. This is what central banks do. There's no question that then they say, oh, we need that. We need that. There's always something they need. They need the police. They need the central bank. But we often, through history, tried to figure out what is it that only we can do together. So I think here in Britain, they thought, oh, we need to build all these houses, but we need to pool our deposits in order to fund them. So they created, what do you call it here, building society or thrift? We call it, yeah. There's lots of things. In the US, we thought, you know what? We need a lot of businesses to form. And so we're going to create these laws about issuing securities and stocks and bonds. So what I think is happening is everyone realizes that it's not just pooling our deposits and our money where we can do things. It's also pooling all of our behavioral data together, or pooling and making into a network different facets of everyday facts and what we do. And this is why you see the large technology conglomerates are trying to do just that. They are trying to know what we purchase, what we are searching for, who our friends are. Everything is linked. And there becomes this question of, will 5 or 6 of them, with this term artificial intelligence, which is largely a marketing term, will they be able to use this to extract extraordinary private gain off of what is really all of our information? And how do we ultimately regulate that? How do we think about that? And I think in the US, I can tell you, we are starting to exercise the muscles again about going after monopolies, about looking at different ways to look at data and frankly, to think even about setting the price. And I think that we want to look not just at this problem, but always think, what is it that we are doing together to solve big problems? And I think that is often the big opportunity to create enormous wealth extraction. So I think that's part. I don't know if I've answered your correctly, but I think that is part of this. And you do see that the ability to tap in to the Treasury payment system, the ability to get all of the CFPB files on what all bank and tech company payment systems are doing, there is obviously a desire to catalog all of that information and maybe even call it a trade secret for private gain.
Can I just add something to the AI question, or did you want to go to another question?
Add something. I'll add something.
So it's, why don't you add something first?
Oh, okay, cool. So I really like this question because in one of the case studies in my PhD, I'm looking at the global political economy of digital transformation. I look at how digital financialization is happening with like DPI, so like digital public infrastructure and digital platforms. And in the context of Kenya, I'm interested in understanding how are they using the behavioral data that they collect from these platforms that they're able to collate and link through the use of digital identity and how is that affecting people? And so in the case, I'm able to trace that to certain types of predatory dynamics. So predatory abstraction. This is coming from the work of Tressie Cotto McMillan, sociologist, so awesome. And it's harmful to people, I argue, and it's actually impacting like more rising debt in terms of how much consumer health-related debt people are carrying and how much debt people have, period. And it's quite harmful. And so I'm trying to say, what are the material implications of that with respect to people's lives? And so as Rohit is talking about, this is actually happening in other parts of the world currently. And so I don't know if that kind of brings it together or not, but I really loved your question.
Thank you. Awesome. So, I mean, it's interesting because you can take a question, whether it's climate or AI, and kind of break it down into sub-questions, and then you could start talking about, again, state capacity, DOGE kinds of, because I just think DOGE is one of different global, ambitions around the state. So the first thing is, again, where did AI come from? And of course, there's huge amounts of private sector investment now. They are the biggest investors in it. But it actually came from speech recognition technology that was from DARPA. So we don't have to go into the usual story, but that's where it came from. And actually, we have one of our PhD students, again, Josh Ensminger, hopefully he's in the room, who has a whole PhD on this. Second, they're currently, actually, because of this huge amounts of wealth that I would call rents, we need to distinguish rents from profits, that have been gained by how the tech companies have gained what you rightly just talked about in terms of the kind of a social creation, collective value creation. So we socialize the risks, privatize the rewards, and also reduce tax massively along the way. The amount of wealth that currently is in kind of the 4 or 5 biggest tech companies is being used, and I think there's very little work on this, to hemorrhage, if you want, to attract like the top AI people and all the science around AI from public labs like DARPA, from public and other universities, and just that skills drain. It's really hard to regulate a system if you don't have knowledge about it. I'm not saying governments don't have knowledge about AI, but it's not like, oh, the private sector is so much better at it. No, they've become, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We pretended that the private sector were the ones who did all the technology. We allowed them to lobby in all sorts of ways, and I'm much more interested in the tax lobbying that's not like corporate income tax and kind of, the top marginal taxation rate that I talked about before, but all sorts of other taxes that specifically the tech companies lobbied for. It was the National Venture Capital Association, by the way, that got capital gains tax to fall by 50% in 4 years in the US with a narrative about where innovation came from. That increased their wealth. Anyway, I don't want to go too much on that, but that's a huge issue. Then another thing, because we work a lot with cities, with neighborhoods like Camden, with countries like Brazil, but also with UN agencies, so on and so forth. The city level work we've done recently in Spain, at least up until recently with Barcelona, with Ada Colau, the mayor, it was so interesting how she said, we need to actually regain that capacity. And she started to kind of hire nerds, basically, not like, what's his name, Dominic Cummings said here, we need nerds in government. No, in order to tackle this really difficult problem, we need the top kind of hackers, computer hackers in the city government.
We did the same thing at the CFPB.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And it was very powerful.
And so just experiments like that where that capacity is actually being brought back in because it becomes ambitious and really cool to work with the city to tackle this problem. And lastly, just because I said and you said the word, or I said rents, you said excessive wealth, or wealth, how do you say, extraction. If you don't know the difference between profits and rents, right, in a macroeconomic agency, in the Treasury, in the national accounting, you cannot solve this problem because most of the huge amounts of wealth in this sector are actually rents. And we have a project, I'll just finish with this, you can look at it on the IIPP website, called Algorithmic Rents, to actually really plot what Shoshana Zuboff calls in surveillance capitalism when she says you think you're searching Google for free, they're searching you for free. That actually changed over time. It didn't used to be that way. So we should be able to plot when did value creation, because of course Google created lots of value, turn into value extraction. But if you don't have the economic category of rents, which Marx had, which Smith had, with Ricardo had, you actually can't even talk about value extraction because you don't actually have an economic measure for it.
This question requires more than I think that each of the three of us could probably talk about this question for like an hour. But I just want to say a couple of very brief things and reiterate something I said in the opening statement, which is the CFPB is an extraordinarily important case study in how one might think about the creation and encouragement of public value in relation to AI and platform companies, because of the model of pulling together a lot of experts, right, with a clear mandate. There's by the way a person at Cambridge, Virginia Leavell, who has been starting to sort of argue for this approach, generally in this space. It's also very, very instructive about the question of market shaping, because the ideology, the myth that we have just like freedom, right? That's not what is going on here. Okay, and we have a system of intellectual property that was created to deal with the last earthquake in this space, the printing press. Right, we have a system of copyright law and libel and so forth that was designed to rein in the really destructive potentialities that exist in a world in which I can steal your intellectual property. That legal regime is being countermanded in the interests of the AI rentiers. Right, there's a huge fight in this country, in the United Kingdom, about copyright law, about creators and the ability of the AI companies to essentially steal their work in little pieces. Okay, now stealing, I can say as a lawyer, stealing is what the law says it is. Right, so if you make it legal, it's no longer stealing. That's market shaping. Right, that's market shaping by the big tech companies in their interest through their influence over the political system. The idea that somehow there's freedom and intervention is nonsense. There's a battle over who the state will serve, right? And there's no more obvious example of market shaping than looking at a property regime, a pre-existing intellectual property regime, and essentially ripping it up in the interests of big tech companies.
Thank you for that great opening round. So we're going to try to take a couple of questions at the same time. We'll try to take, where are the questions? Raise your hand. Okay, we're going to get these two at the same time and try and fit them in.
Hi, my name is Zach Rosen. Thank you all so much. This is really incredible to listen to you all talk about everything. Something I've been very curious to see in the aftermath of the publishing of Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson is the kind of conflict between basically proponents of their hypothesis about kind of regulation interfering with state capacity and making it harder for kind of mission-driven like state projects of increasing housing stock and green energy capacity, and detractors who have been trying to discuss or have been arguing that it's not a matter of regulation undermining state capacity, but rather kind of consolidated power resulting in state capture and just making it easier for markets to be not free or keeping markets closed and things expensive. I was curious to hear from you all about kind of how you think about this debate, the extent to which these theories are actually in conflict with each other, and where you think of basically how you think about how we can create more affordable housing, more green energy capacity, and basically bring about these outcomes that we're seeking.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Paul Fennell. I'm actually a practitioner in local government AI and technology. I currently chair the Welsh Local Government Association for AI and Technology. My question's around DPI and the definition and understanding of it. Do you feel maybe the definition itself has been captured already and financialized? In that, and this is not to denigrate the works of colleagues at GDS and so on things like identity, data handling, payment handling. Those to me feel like modular components, not digital platforms, not infrastructure. Public infrastructure might feel more like hyperscale cloud that actually belongs to the public, and AI models develop transparently in terms of the data that they're trained on, the guardrails that they have, and so on. So without wanting to lead you too much, do you feel that there's actually a danger there in the way that we think about DPI? As an adjunct, I note the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are currently advertising for a director of DPI.
Yeah, so let me, I'm sorry that I didn't get your name, but the question for the audience who couldn't hear was really about this concept of digital public infrastructure and the kind of cringy acronyms that we all use in that space. So I guess I kind of like to go to first principles, and I'll tell a very, very brief story. When I was a Federal Trade Commissioner, I'd get these pitches from e-commerce companies saying, you know, we envision an America where there is a place in every community where you can pick up and send, you know, your packages. And I said, you know, we created that in the Constitution. It's called the post office. And you're sort of creating this privatized dressing on it by trying to create network effects that ultimately you can impose a rent on every single thing. So there are some obvious things that market competition alone and entry will not solve. And these very, very big infrastructure questions do need often a public solution. So I'll let Nye address more of this, but obviously the identity verification part in banking, the ability to switch and move your account information, which was something the CFPB did a huge push on to make it easier to switch your bank. I think that we have to be careful about the words we use. And the truth is nothing is truly fully public because there's always something that it is resting on. And the truth is that it is some amalgam of public and private. It is a joint venture. And we should be thinking about where do we want to put profit motive and where do we just want to create the playground where everyone can play. I think that's really the core questions that I think about. Now, just real quick on the recent, this is really, I think, been more of a U.S. question about the book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, Abundance, which I think the shorthand of it is that there are processes and regulations that block the progress in terms of building more housing or whatever it may be. I actually think an optimistic take on the book is that, sure, we should be on guard for all sorts of processes and solving for the sake of processes. My experience, I've worked in 4 agencies, those processes are created because incumbents use political power to create hurdles and blockades for there to be sometimes structural shifts in the marketplace. And they will booby trap a law to relitigate the same question over and over and over again to the point where it doesn't get solved. I don't think we have people who want to create endless process. I think the incumbents are the ones who make it force. So I don't recommend to people that they use that book as their playbook. Instead, we really need to think about what is the role of the state and where should they play in the joint venture for that we're trying to do. We should also recognize we have a lot of joint ventures that haven't worked out. Our patent system for pharmaceuticals, we know, is really, patents are supposed to be covenant between sovereign and creator. But I think the failure of developed countries to waive the intellectual property for the COVID-19 vaccine is a devastating testament to whether it is a joint venture at all. So that's what we're going to need to think through about where did we go wrong and how do we reconstruct.
Let me just say something about, very quickly, about the abundance issue. I was approached by some advocates of that set of ideas early on. I'm not going to say who when I tell you what they said. All right, because they came to me and some other people who were who had some relationship with the public sector labor movement, right, government workers, and they said, we represent some Silicon Valley investors who want to build housing in the Bay Area, and and our business model won't allow us to pay the prevailing wage, right, which is the sort of middle-class wage that's required for government projects that more or less tracks union contracts in the construction industry in the United States. We want to pay a sub-prevailing wage to build housing. And in order so the subtext being, in order so we can realize the return on equity capital that we think is minimum for our Silicon Valley capital. And they wondered whether the public sector unions would like that idea. And we have this idea in the labor movement called solidarity. We're not real keen on what they were proposing because, of course, it can be turned on the public sector workers next. It was the attempt to move into housing the philosophy that the Silicon Valley community brought to the Obama administration in climate, which was, let's source the cheapest possible climate technology from China, right, from forced labor in Xinjiang, right, and that'll make cheap power cheap. What they didn't realize was it'll make it hated. It'll make it hated by working people. I'm all for the abundance agenda of investment, of growth, of abundance. I'm not for the agenda of low wages and crushing working people. And by the way, neither are the voters going to be. It is a pathway to disaster, in my view, politically.
Just super quickly before I let Nye close this wonderful session that you designed, organized, and thought of, just on the DPI to say we have a whole website on this question, and there's a lot of work being done also by David Eves here. We wrote a paper together on what is public, what's the P in DPI, and that's what you're asking, because lots of things might even be free, but are they public, right? So. And it's interesting that you mentioned GDS. Mike Bracken was upstairs. I don't know if he's here. We were having lunch. Is he here? Anyway, it doesn't matter. So when he first told me about GDS, there were so many stories that just kind of resonated, but just one. He said the first thing we did was change like how we were talking about people. People are not customers. They're not clients, right? They got stuff they need, and this platform better make it easier for them to access it. We then also separately with someone else wrote a paper on how would you bring a human rights dimension to that, right? If you have the right to access things that you really need in the most seamless way, what does that mean for the design features? But it's just interesting how you phrased it, right? Is it just tech? Is it even just public tech? Or what is the design around the common good, around public value, all the stuff we talk about here, the lens through which you then design. It's not neutral. Yeah, and I could say more, but I won't. But yeah, look up our work on what's public about DPI. Thank you.
So please join me in a moment in thanking our wonderful panel for a fantastic start. And I'll just point out, Rethinking the State, we have a whole lineup of activities coming up over the next few days, so please feel free to take part and let's meet. And yeah, please join me in thanking our fantastic panel.
And